Yeah, hi, this is Harold Pollack. I just wanted to make a quick little video about the basics of screening tests. I've been noticing that a lot of my followers on Twitter and people in my family on Facebook are kind of asking some basic questions about how screening tests work, whether it's HIV tests or COVID tests. Um, so I thought I'd just go over some of the basics so that so that we could understand it. Um, so people, let me start with some basics. We often ask, how accurate is a screening test? And if you think about it, this word accuracy is really not self-defining. It has many meanings. And one thing we might mean is, how often is this test correct? And if we're looking for a really rare condition, I've got a great test that's incredibly accurate. It's just says you don't have it. It's always negative. If we have a condition that is only present among 1 in 10,000 people, my test that just says you don't have it, is 99.99% accurate. Now, that's actually a pretty useful test for some things. I've got some anxious relatives who are like worried, I think I've got thumb falling off syndrome. Like, no, you don't have it, Mom. You just don't have it. But that's not really, very useful for most things. Now, what we might mean is, if I actually had the condition, how often does this test say that I have it? And that's called sensitivity. So I actually have COVID. I take the test. Well, the test say you have COVID. That's sensitivity. The opposite thing is to say, if I really don't have the condition, how often will the test say that I don't have it? That's called specificity. So the sensitivity, it can detect the condition when I've got it, and the specificity, it can rule out the condition when I don't have it. Those are two things that matter a lot. And they sort of take as ground truth. I know what I've got in my body. What does the test say? Now, the flip side of that is interpreting a test, that's imperfect. So suppose we ask, if my test comes out positive, how confident should I be that I actually have the condition? That's called positive predictive value. So, there's a home pregnancy test. The little plus sign is there. How likely is it that the person's pregnant? Or we might mean the opposite. If my test is negative, how confident should I be that I don't have the condition? That's called negative predictive value. And every one of those terms is important for a particular application or for a particular policy question, but they're all different. Sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, negative predictive value. So, just to reinforce that. So I actually have COVID. I go to Walgreens, I buy the home test and I test. How likely is the test to come out positive when that is what the test should say? That's sensitivity, versus specificity. I don't have COVID. How often is the test negative? These are actually technical properties of the test itself. They kind of go with the biology, the way the test is made. If you went to lots of different places in the country, different prevalences of COVID, whatever, the sensitivity and the specificity should basically be the same no matter where you're doing the test. Second question is, I take the test, it comes out positive. How scared should I be that I've got the condition, or how likely do I think I am to be pregnant if I'm taking a pregnancy test? That's the positive predictive value. And similarly, the negative predictive value, the PPV and the NPV, they reflect the sensitivity and the specificity, but they also reflect the underlying risk within the population being tested. Suppose that I test positive for bubonic plague. I'm not worried. The PPV is 0. It's just not present in the population. Same with smallpox. I just do not have it. If a condition is very, very rare, most of the positives, or many of the positives, are going to be false positives. The PPV is going to be low for a lot of rare conditions. When a condition is very common, a lot of the negative tests are going to be false negatives. And I should say that the PPV and the NPV and the sensitivity and the specificity, they can actually vary with the trajectory of the disease or the infection that you have, for example, for thinking about COVID. So, for example, suppose I go out and have unsafe sex, and then the next morning I take a standard HIV test. In other words, I've just triggered many of the people watching this video under the age of 35. That test is very often going to just be negative because my body hasn't had the time to produce the the materials that would generate a positive HIV test. So, same with COVID. There's stages of infection that matter a lot for what the test will indicate. Now, I should say that in going through all of these concepts, we could sort of jam at the whiteboard with conditional probabilities and talk about Bayes' rule and stuff like that. But we really don't have to do that to understand the basic concepts. A 3x3 table of numbers gets us most of the way there. So let me show you that. So let's suppose that we have something called Pollack syndrome that we're looking for. And we have a population of 1 million people that we're sort of studying. And in that population, 1% of the people have Pollack syndrome. And we've got a test for Pollack syndrome, and it's got a sensitivity of 98%, and it's got a specificity of 99%. So 1% of the population have Pollack syndrome. That's 10,000 people out of 1 million. Of those people, because the sensitivity is 98%, 9,800 of those people are going to test positive, and 200 people are going to test negative. And those 200 people are false negatives. That's clearly a problem for this test, particularly if this syndrome is really serious. Among the people who don't have it, there's 990,000 who don't have it. 99% of those people are going to test negative. As I'm sure you've worked out in your head, 980,100 of those people are going to test negative. That's 99%. The remaining 9,900, that's 1% of those people, are going to test positive. They're going to be false positives. So there's lots of false positives here, and there's a few false negatives. So so let's think about what positive predictive value is here. So what positive predictive value is it says I got a positive test result. I know that I'm in one of these two boxes, but I don't know which one. And the chance that I actually have the condition is the proportion, 9,800 as a proportion of this total in this column. So it's 9,800 divided by 19,700. That's about 49.7%. My negative predictive value is I know I tested negative. So I know I'm in this column, but I don't know if I'm here or I'm here. Well, the NPV is just 980,100 divided by 980,300, which is like 99.98%. So the NPV on this thing is really, really high, which is not surprising. Only 1% of the population has it. And of those 1%, we can sort of 98% of those people would have been detected. So if I get a negative result, I'm really very, very confident I don't have this thing. Let's suppose we have a more sensitive test now. And now there's a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity in the way tests are designed. Say you're looking for a particular protein that constitutes a positive test. And if the level of that protein is over 100, we'll say you have a positive result. And if it's under 100, we say it's negative. Well, if I set the threshold at 200, I'm gonna be more picky. And if I set the threshold at 50, I'm gonna be a lot quicker to sort of pull the trigger and say you're a positive result. And the quicker I am to pull the trigger, the more likely I am to get some false positives. And that's the kind of the price I'm paying to avoid the false negatives. So here's a test that's sort of more ready to pull the trigger. It's got a 99% sensitivity, but the specificity now drops to 98%. And let's think about how this is different. So now I'm going to get 100 false negatives, but I've got 19,800 false positives now. That's 2% of all the people who don't have the thing. So if I get a positive result, the positive predictive value is 9,900 as a proportion of this whole column. So the PPV actually drops to about 34.5%. Now the NPV is phenomenally high. It's the ratio of 970,200 over 970,300. So it's 99.99%. So with this really sensitive test, if I test negative, I am just really happy. But if I test positive, there's only about a third chance that I actually have this thing. Okay. Now, by the way, note that everything I just showed you was based on a very rare condition. 1% of the people had it. What happens if I do exactly the same kind of stuff, but now I have a more common thing? I'll call it Pollack syndrome. And this one is actually present in half the population. So let's run exactly the same test that I did the first time. It's got a sensitivity of 98%, and it's got a specificity of 99%. let's look at how the PPV and the NPV might be a little different when I've got a more common condition. So first of all, I've got 10,000 false negatives now because there's just 500,000 people have the condition. So 2% of that is a bigger group of people. So I've got way more of these people. I actually have fewer people who are in the false positive category because it's 1% of this now smaller number. So my PPV now, and I got vastly more people who test positive because they actually have it, just because the disease is really common. So what is my PPV? It's 490,000 divided by 495,000. It's basically, it's 98.99%. So if I test positive for this thing, I got it. Very high probability. It's a common condition, and I tested positive for it. That makes me very confident that I have. What happens if I get a negative result? Well, interestingly enough, now the NPV is the ratio of these two numbers. It's 98.02%. So what's interesting about that is, 98% is pretty high, but there's basically 2% chance that if I test negative, I actually have the thing. That's a pretty high rate of false negatives for certain things. If I'm spreading a contagious disease, for example, I could be concerned about this. The NPV before was basically 100%, and now it's dropped to 98%. So, whenever I increase the prevalence dramatically and I leave the test the same, I make my PPV look a lot better, but I make my NPV look worse. Here's just a graph of what the PPV and the NPV look like if I use that test and I just vary the prevalence of the disease in the population. So if we look at the positive predictive value, that's the blue thing. You see at really low rates, like 1%, you see the PPV actually drops to like 70%. And then it pretty rapidly comes up. By the time you get to 10% prevalence, it's over 90% PPV. And then it sort of asymptotes out towards 100%. If you look at the NPV of this test, it's really, really high until we get to really pretty high prevalences. So, when we get up to like 60% of the population actually have the thing, now the NPV starts to noticeably fall off. So, so this test would have, the NPV would really start to be a problem if we had, really, really common prevalence of this disease, or if the cost of missing, the cost of a false negative was just really high. Now you might say, which test is better, the one that's more sensitive and a little bit less specific, or the one that's super specific and a little bit less sensitive? And the answer is, you're right, both. A lot depends on the context, what you want to have in a screening test. One thing that matters is the prevalence of the condition, as you just saw from the graph. Secondly, what's the clinical value of early identification of a condition? Because information is valuable when it actually changes your behavior. You do something about that. How would the information be used? It may just be that the information, reduces anxiety, something like that, but it may be that you actually need to act. What's the cost of a false positive compared to a false negative? Is there stigma or social harm connected with a positive test? That's a really important question for a lot of things. So suppose, for example, I have a screening assessment that I use to try to find parents who are mistreating their children. If I have a sensitive but low PPV screening test, what I'm doing is I'm saying about a lot of parents, maybe I'm putting a notation in their, pediatric folder at the local hospital or something. Hey, I think that this person might be mistreating their child. Wow, that is potentially incredibly harmful. And of course, if you think about ways that racial bias and other things might come in, you could imagine that would be just an arena where you have to be just super careful. Suppose on the other hand, I have a sensitive but low PPV screening test and I'm looking for diabetes. It's still not good to give somebody a false positive, but it may be that the consequence is that person becomes anxious and they have to go to the diabetes clinic. But once we actually look more carefully, we realize, oh, they don't have diabetes. It's not so bad. But many, many genetic conditions, we really have to think hard about that, particularly if there's a distinction between a genetic finding and the way that it's phenotypically expressed. So, one of the conditions I've written about is something called Fragile X syndrome. There's a lot of people who have a genetic genotype that is that's called a full mutation with Fragile X. But then you look at what is their actual disability in life, and turns out it's often smaller than one might think, or not detectable. Do we really want to have that positive test, part of that person's official diagnostic record, and in what way? The other question is, what kind of follow-up tests might be available to investigate whether an initial positive test is accurate? This is often a really important issue in prenatal screening. Suppose I have, there are various rare conditions that can affect a developing fetus, and I have a blood test that can look for some of the proteins that are associated with that rare condition. And those proteins don't have a particularly high positive predictive value that says, hey, you definitely have that condition. But if you have that condition, those proteins are going to be present. So what we can do is we can do the blood test on everybody. And then when the blood test gives us a reason to be concerned, then we could do something that's more costly or more burdensome or more risky to really pin it down. So, suppose we have a $1 blood test, and everybody that we're concerned about after that blood test, we can do a $1,000, more elaborate, test to follow. You don't want to do amniocentesis, on every 28-year-old pregnant patient, but you might want to do amniocentesis for a 28-year-old pregnant patient when this blood test says, hey, there's an issue that we really need to track down. So what kind of follow-up test is often important? Okay, so now that's all really interesting stuff about screening tests. What about COVID? Pilorowski and colleagues actually did some work that I found in the Journal of Infectious Disease, where they just looked at, the Abbott test, and it's called the BinaxNow test. And they had late 2020 data from a San Francisco public testing site, and they sort of went through some of the math of that. And I'm not going to say too much about COVID, but I'll just show you what it looks like, in a COVID context. So one of the things that they did is they set a threshold in their test looking for sort of what's called a high cycle threshold, which kind of corresponds to infectiousness. And I'm not going to say too much about clinical COVID stuff because I'm not an expert on that. But they found that using that threshold, that the test had a sensitivity of 93.8% and had a specificity of about 99.9%. There's a lot under the hood about the trajectory of COVID that would be really important about what these thresholds mean and how they might change. And if someone's early in an infection, would they test positive on this? But just given these numbers, what would that imply about positive and negative predictive value, particularly if you thought about testing within populations that had kind of different prevalences as the epidemic evolves? I was just listening on the radio this morning. There was a group where the prevalence in the tested group went up to 16%, which was quite alarming. So what does that look like? Well, I've got my same 3x3 table here. And so if here I assumed a 10% base prevalence. This is not good. This is of the people being tested, 10% are going to be sort of new positives. If the tests were perfect. So of those 100,000 people who have it, that's 10% of that population, 93,800 are going to test positive and 6,200 are going to test negative. 900,000 don't have it. And of those people, only 900 test positive, but 899,100 are going to test negative. So, in fact, in total, 94,700 people are going to test positive and 905,300 are going to test negative. And if we work out the positive predictive value in this population, it's this 93,800 over 94,700, about 99.05% positive predictive value. And the negative predictive value is 899,100 over 905,000. It's about 99.3%. So the NPV and the PPV are both above 99%. This is a really good test at that 10% base prevalence level. And just what does it look like if we vary the prevalence with this test? So we're using this BinaxNow rapid antigen test, but we've got different populations. If it's a really rare if COVID is really rare in the population, the positive predictive value is low. And at 2%, it's like 95. The PPV is like 95% if truly 2% of the population are being tested are infected. And the PPV kind of asymptotes up. It's above 98% once you get about 5% prevalence or more in the tested population. The NPV is very, very good until we get up to, it's basically above 99% until you get to about a little bit over 10% prevalence. And then it starts to fall. And even at 20% prevalence, where the PPV is, is way over 99%, the NPV is still above 98%. So this is a really good test to reassure people, that they're very unlikely to have it if they get a negative test, and the PPV looks pretty impressive too. So the people that invented these tests actually seem to know a lot about how to do their jobs. So that's really about all I want to say now. Question for you: what should I include next time? And thank you for bearing with me. And I'm going to stop the recording now.